Hi, everyone. We're going to do a very interesting podcast today, an interview today with Mazin Sidahmed. Mazin is a reporter in New York, actually, and he's doing a lot of great work in the immigration space. So I thought we definitely is good to have him on board to hear what he has to say because he's in the trenches and he sees just what we're seeing every day. He's bringing that information out to the public, which is really important. Now, my internet connection on my side is a little going up and down, it seems. So hopefully we can get everything. But Mazin, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Mazin, why don't you tell us about yourself, how you became a reporter?
Great. Yeah, it's really great to be here and talking with you. So I had a bit of a strange path into journalism. I actually started as an electrical and computer engineer. I come from immigrant parents, and I think that a stable job in engineering was more desirable than the less stable industry of journalism. But I still dabbled in journalism while I was working as an engineer. I wrote about music, mostly hip hop. I had like a hip hop radio show,
Mhm.
and I maintained this interest, and I've always been a news junkie. So I graduated. I worked for a while, and it just didn't really agree with me. I'm more of like a social being, and I felt kind of isolated in the field. So I retained this interest in journalism. And I actually went to Beirut because my family was living there, Beirut, Lebanon. And I was kind of road thinking about maybe going back to school to take journalism. And I
What years were you
decided
in Europe?
I was there in 2013.
How was the situation
2000,
in 2013? When was the war, last war?
the last war was in 2006, but when I got there, the Syrian civil war was ongoing. And Lebanon, while I was there in 2014, had received its 1 millionth Syrian refugee. The population, to give you some context, of Lebanon is 4 million. So to have an additional 1 million refugees coming into the country,
If you don't
you can
mind,
imagine.
let's get into that. One of my favorite things about being an immigration lawyer is I get the best news because I get people talking to people that are on the ground. How does a population like in Lebanon handle that influx? And what type of Syrians were they? Were they just every type of Syrian? Were they like the rich ones who came, or how was it?
Yeah, it was across the economic spectrum. So how does a country like that handle it? That was really the story. I ended up deciding to stay and live in Beirut and work for an English language newspaper there, mainly covering the refugee crisis. Now, the Lebanon has a long history of taking in refugees who were displaced because of regional conflict. There's a huge Palestinian community in Lebanon who were displaced from like the 1960s onwards, and their presence has caused some um, rifts among the different sectarian,
Hmm.
one of the different religious sects in Lebanon. So the country as a whole, politically, the issue of Syrian refugees was like a real hot potato. Like a lot of people did not want Syrian refugees coming into the country because of their previous experience with Palestinian refugees, and because Syria had previously almost controlled Lebanon, like the Assad regime had basically controlled Lebanon up until about the year 2004 or five. So there was a lot of bad blood.
Yeah.
So the people leaving Syria were across the economic spectrum. You had highly educated middle class people who were working as doctors, lawyers, engineers, what have you, fleeing, and lower income people, and they were all experiencing very different things. It's an incredibly expensive place to live, Lebanon. So you'd have to be very wealthy to be able to go there and rent an apartment and live there. So there
Hmm.
was only a small section of the Syrians who were maybe occupying more wealthy lifestyles in Beirut. The vast majority were living in refugee camps along the Syria-Lebanon border. So there's a mountain range along the Syria-Lebanon border called the Beqa. And in that valley, there were just tons of refugee camps that were run by the UN. The Palestinian camps that I told you about that had been in place for many decades. A lot of Syrians ended up staying there. And really, the way in which the country handled it is the UN ran almost like a shadow government, providing direct services to Syrian refugees. The government completely opposed building any kind of infrastructure where Syrians could live, because they didn't want this to be a permanent location. They wanted Syrians to go back as quickly as possible. And that meant that the UN basically had to provide, and is still providing, intense amount of services to help Syrians just get food, find work, um, get access to healthcare, burials, like you name it, across the spectrum. All of those services had to be provided by third-party organizations, because the Lebanese government did not want to provide services for Syrian refugees.
Now, the Lebanese government has been going through intense upheaval in the last couple of years. They overthrew the prime minister, who was the son of as a Hariri. I mean, a lot of rumors and information came out. Not sure true or not. Some crazy stuff that this guy was up to. Just a spoiled kind of kid having fun in the world. But do you know if this refugee crisis had any effect on that, or was it just the underlying economics and sectarian issues that people are frustrated with?
Yeah, I haven't followed Lebanon as closely since I left in 2015, but the underlying issues that the sectarian government has, the way in which power is distributed in Lebanon, has been a long-standing issue. Excuse me. Had been a long-standing issue prior to the refugee crisis, and a lot of the people that were involved in the protests against the government were younger, more liberal and progressive people that maybe didn't have the same level of qualms about the refugee crisis. A lot of the people that did not want the refugees in Lebanon were people from the Christian majority parties, or the Shia majority parties, who felt that a large influx of Sunni Muslims would tip the balance in favor against them, and potentially create new sectarian conflicts. And also, they felt that a lot of the people fleeing Syria were opposed to the government, which some people within those parties supported. Now, that underlying obviously affects every element of day-to-day life, this level of refugees in the country. But the protests that are still ongoing and that have been happening over the past few years, my perception of them is that they are mainly driven by the lack of opportunity that a lot of young people feel like is present in Lebanon, the the difficulties of creating any infrastructure, or getting basic services without paying people, or having to go through kind of personal networks to achieve anything. So I think the two things, while they definitely affect each other, were somewhat independent.
The system that they have, and if people aren't aware, in Lebanon they have a system where, as you were talking about, there's a power sharing between the Christian, Sunni, and Shia groups there. Each gets one aspect of the government. It's kind of an insane system to continue going, and it really creates structures that may not independently exist. And adding the Syrians to that, because Syria is being an ally of Iran, but maybe the government at least is. Maybe the population isn't. So they're Sunnis, they tip the balance there, but at the same time, they may be, because they're maybe pro-Iranian, they may go on the Shia side. There's Christian Syrians that are flat too. So it really just throws everything through a loop. That whole location, Lebanon, should be one of the most successful, like a Switzerland really situation, but they really kneecap them so bad that they can't even get off the ground, even though there's some filthy rich people that live there, very successful international kind of people. It's a really insane situation, everything going on in Lebanon.
It is incredibly unfortunate when you see the ingenuity and the talent pool that exists in Lebanon. They have some of the brightest and most intellectual and advanced people in pretty much every sphere of life. But the system in place is such that it really stifles any kind of advancement along a lot of different sectors. And yeah, like the power sharing agreement that you mentioned, the reason the refugee crisis is so worrying to a lot of the different players in that system is that all of the different agencies are distributed based on a census which was taken 80 years ago, and there hasn't been one since. And there's a concern that if another census was done and there's 1 million Syrian refugees in place, and it may be increases the number of Sunnis in the country, that it would affect the the outcomes of like who gets power and
Yeah.
what have you. So it's an incredibly complicated country and system, but yeah, it was. It's a beautiful place, and I think anyone who's been to Lebanon will tell you that it's just remarkable. Like from a cultural perspective, from a landscape perspective, you know, from the people
Yeah.
perspective, it is a beautiful place.
And so, what year did you end up leaving Lebanon?
So I left Lebanon in 2015 to come to New York, where I studied for a year. I ended up deciding to go and study and get at Columbia University to kind of complete my transition into journalism. And after I left, while I was at Columbia, I wrote for Politico briefly about city issues. But then after I left, I started working for The Guardian in their New York office. Covering national issues around it was an election year of 2016, and also with a focus on Muslim Americans and the ways in which Muslim Americans are sometimes targeted by the state, often through their immigration status.
Mhm. And now you co-founded a nonprofit organization. Could you talk about that and the goals of the organization?
So in 2018, which is say in 2017, myself and my now co-founder Max Siegelbaum, he was working at the Denver Post, and I was based in New York. Shortly after Trump's election, we wanted to work on a project together that would examine interior enforcement and how interior enforcement has changed under the Trump administration. And there was an intense focus on the border and DC, but we felt like there was a big story happening in the major U.S. cities, and we wanted to kind of maybe work on a national project on how big US cities with large immigrant populations were being affected by this new prioritization by this new government. And while we were working on it, a former boss of mine told me about this company called Civil, and they were basically trying to come up with a new way for news organizations to generate revenue,
Mhm.
and they've created this new platform. And in order to get it off the ground, they wanted some newsrooms that they would fund to basically be guinea pigs for this experiment of how to fund news. So they were taking pictures, and he said that we should pitch them if I had any ideas. So me and my co-founder, we said, well, why don't we take this project that we're working on and we turn it into a sustained news organization providing local coverage of immigration issues, the ground level policy shifts of immigration issues, and also create a news source that would ensure that the people who are most affected by the stories were also the people reading them. Both of us have covered migration. He was based in Cairo while I was based in Beirut, and both of us had experiences of writing about immigration and speaking to sources. Like I would go to a refugee camp in the Bekaa Valley, spend all day there talking to people, go home and write up a piece, and it would be written in English, and it would never actually be read by the people I actually wrote about, who were the featured people in the story. So we wanted to flip that as well. So we pitched them this idea, a newsroom called Documented, that would cover local immigration issues in the New York area and the ground level shifts. And they loved it. And they gave us the funding to do it and helped us build our website. And we've been doing it for about 2 years now. And yeah, it's been an incredible experience. We launched the week the family separation was really causing massive headlines in the US. So we hit the ground with a lot of news to cover, and it's kind of been the same ever since.
And one of the big pieces you did is quite extensive work going to immigration courts with your reporters and tracking and just keeping an eye on things. Could you talk about what you did exactly and what you learned from that?
Yeah, so when we first launched, we knew one of the main things we wanted to cover was the immigration courts. Yeah, every major US city has an immigration court, and local journalists in general, the major newspapers, they might they might have a reporter who's dedicated to covering the criminal court, the federal criminal court, but no one who's going into immigration court regularly. And for the first 2 years, immigration attorneys will know Jeff Sessions really went about completely upending decades of precedents in immigration courts nationwide. and we were covering them in this kind of piecemeal way, but we really wanted to get an understanding of like how the system had changed. You talk to immigration attorneys, and they explain to you how different things have become and how difficult they've become. But we really wanted to capture that and figure out a way to do that. So we came up with this idea. It was inspired by one of our board members, Paul Moses, who had done something similar in criminal court, where we got funding to hire 6 reporters to go to the immigration courts from morning till close every day for 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
One would go in per day, and they would just basically alternate and try and sit in on as many individual hearings as possible. With the help of different sources, we built like an intake sheet for them to fill out for every single hearing they saw, the names of the attorney, the name of the ICE attorney, the name of the judge, was matter of Castro 2 mentioned, was matter of AB mentioned, things like that. And like a little bit of narrative about what they saw, the quality of the interpretation, a number of things. And over the course of 3 months, they sat in on over 200 hearings and gave us a really detailed picture of how the New York City immigration courts have changed. And it was incredible to see because, the New York immigration courts previously had this reputation as a place with a pretty high asylum grant rate. There was access to counsel through a New York City council-funded program for detained immigrants. There was judges who had been at the bench for a very long time. And there was just a general feeling that the court was a place that was, I wouldn't say favorable to immigrants, but maybe more favorable than other immigration courts. And in the space of about a year and a half, the Trump administration completely reversed that. And it became incredibly difficult for a lot of immigrants going through there to win asylum. And the whole system had come to a halt, really. It was cases were getting delayed because of in absentias, video teleconferencing had gone up dramatically. So a lot of malfunctionings were causing cases to be rescheduled, and people would end up spending longer in jail. Just a myriad of issues.
Interesting. And so, how open were the judges or the ICE attorneys in having witnesses? Did they feel comfortable? How was that situation?
Yeah, that was interesting. It was a mixed bag. It was really a mixed bag. So at first, the judges were just like, "What are you doing?" We had a lot of our court reporters basically get kicked out of courtrooms because the judge had told them that you need permission from the press officer to be here. So that's just false. That's just not true. We'd spoken to the press officer. The press officer told them that told us that as long as we had permission from the respondent, we were allowed to sit in on an individual hearing. And the judges, though, were just completely unsettled by this. But it got to a point where the EOIR public information officer had sent an email to all of the judges and said that, there are reporters from Documented who are doing this project. And, if they have permission from an individual, from a respondent, they're allowed to sit in on a hearing. So we managed to get that permission. The ICE attorneys were another can of worms. It was, there was incidents where some ICE attorneys were actually threatening our students, asking them for their details and their information and looking them up, sending their information to other places. One ICE attorney became obsessed with one of our court reporters. She would follow her around the hallways and tell people to not talk to her because, anything they said to her could be printed. One respondent, attorney, and judge had given the reporter permission to enter into an individual on one occasion, and she sat there waiting for it. And then this ICE attorney who kind of had a vendetta against her came in, saw that she was there, went to the respondent, told the respondent, like, you don't have to do this. Like, if you don't want this reporter here, it doesn't mean like it could hurt your case if this story ends up getting published.
The last you
The
want
respondent said
to
they were
anything. Yeah, the client, the applicant, yeah, but it's amazing.
Yeah, but one to finish that, the ICE attorney ended up actually asking counsel if they could go and speak to them privately. So they left, and then they came back, and the immigration attorney said to the judge, I think it's in my client's best interest if the reporter leaves the room, and asked my reporter to leave. So we don't know what the ICE attorney said to the counsel at that moment, but it seems like they basically told them that I'm going to make your life difficult if the reporter is in there.
Yeah. So it just seems some ICE attorneys, you do your job and you might have passion for it, but some of them take it to the next level. It's like police officers who are overzealous. Most police officers are not going to beat up people, but every day I open up Daily Mail. The front news today was some police officer that choked some guy to death over a forged check. And it's like, what? It's just forged a check. I mean, it's bad, but you don't have to kill a person over it. Some people just take their jobs over the top. It's crazy. So, you learn a lot about the immigration system doing this. When I started in immigration law, I would sit in on these court cases to just figure out what's going on. And you quickly realize people have a perception what they see on television from criminal courts and federal courts. There's some sort of organization that is a nice place, but you quickly realize in immigration court that it's a kangaroo court of sorts. And it's also just a mess. There's not enough space. People just are talking
Totally.
over each other, paperwork everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. It was for the reporters. It was an incredible experience for them. They couldn't every day. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. One person, the judge, a judge said to an attorney once that they figured that their client couldn't make bail or make bond, and the attorney said that well, if you said it, then they could make bond. But it turned out the judge had granted bond but sent it to an old address that the person hadn't lived in for about 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
So they'd had this bond approval for a month. They've been sitting in jail for a month, not knowing that the judge had approved bond.
Wow.
And only for the judge had to apologize in the end and say, look, I apologize to the attorney, I apologize to the client, because the correct address was in the file. So things like that, the fact that the whole system is done by paper to this day, really makes you wonder, like you said, how it's so far behind the criminal courts. It's really remarkable. But the work that we did ended up feeding into this project that we released a couple of weeks ago with NPR's Latino USA, about just what you said, how the courts are incredibly difficult to get through if you're an immigrant. And we followed the story of one family who had come from Guatemala in 2018, and were separated. The husband and wife were separated at the border, and then while the wife was released on bond and she was pregnant, the husband ended up spending months in detention and eventually getting deported for because after experiencing a number of indignities across the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you are working with NPR on this program. It's fascinating. You could just go on npr.org. There's interviews with you, and they go through this in Latino USA. What kind of projects are you in the plans on working on right now? I know the whole coronavirus has probably stalled things a little bit, but what do you have plans for the future?
Yeah, so our work currently is really focused a lot on the pandemic. We've about 2 months ago, New York City went into lockdown, and we kind of just started working on two prongs. One prong is how the coronavirus is impacting the immigration system. So we've written extensively about what's been happening in the immigration court, this alliance between the immigration judges, immigration attorneys, and prosecutors. We've written a lot about New York City's courts being shut down and reopened, court staffers catching COVID. We've also written about the detention centers. This has been a massive story nationwide about coronavirus spreading around detention centers. In New Jersey, there was a hunger strike, and a number of detainees caught COVID-19. And upstate New York, in Buffalo, there was also a large number of incidents, even after a judge ordered ICE, ruled against detainees and allowed ICE to keep people in detention. And there was a large number of infections. at the Buffalo Federal Detention Facility. So we've been covering those two-pronged approach, but also providing information. All journalists right now have kind of pivoted towards service journalism to make sure the public knows how they can get help, how they can access healthcare. As an immigration news site, we focus that information for documented immigrants in the city, explaining places they can get funds, how the consequences of getting healthcare, um, different ways in which you can get access to labor help, a number of different things, tenants' rights. So we've been doing a lot of work on that and try and get information out to the public. And I think moving forward, we'll be focusing on those two things and covering how the pandemic has affected immigrants in a number of different ways.
Wonderful. If people wanted to get access to information, what are the best websites to go to?
So you can go on our website, documentedny.com. You can go on our Twitter page as well. It's documentedny on Twitter. And we have a WhatsApp news service in Spanish as well, that where we distribute a lot of information that's targeted for targeted immigrants. It's a really great service that's received like a lot more subscribers during the pandemic. It's just because of the need is so acute. So if you go on documentedny.com/WhatsApp, you can sign up for our WhatsApp news service there as well. Everything is distributed in Spanish. And when people have questions on WhatsApp, we personally will go out and find the information for them or connect them with who can better help them as well.
That's fascinating. Using WhatsApp as this, marketing and connecting tool. That's a good thing. And I talk a lot about attorney marketing and stuff. WhatsApp is just a really unconventional way to do it, but it's really accessible. It's wonderful. And what is your email address? Or if you want to contact you?
Sure, yeah. Feel free to get at me at Mazin. So it's Mazin .Sidahmed, SID for David, AH, M for Mary, ED for David, at documentedny.com.
Is it Ahmed, not Hamid?
Ahmed, yeah.
Okay, because right here on our Zoom, it has your H and A.
So like, it kind of means Mr. Ahmed in.
Okay, so just
Oh, no.
on your Zoom, it has your name switched up. So just in case we want in the future. But Mazin, thank you so much. We'll definitely have you on again. Keep us posted on the work you're doing. I love to have people update on the stuff you're doing.